What would you do if your homeowner association tried to take control of your private land they had no legal claim to, just because they felt entitled to it? For Ethan Caldwell, his home wasn't just property. It was history, a legacy, passed down through 3 generations. Nestled on 10 acres of rolling green lawns, towering oak trees, and a colonial-style estate, it stood as a quiet refuge on the outskirts of a suburban neighborhood. The land had been in his family for over a century, untouched by the creeping regulations of modern development. It was private, legally separate from the homeowner association that governed the houses down the street. And yet, as Ethan stood in his kitchen, pouring his morning coffee, he saw something that made his stomach tighten: a woman in a crisp white blouse and slacks, marching up his driveway like she owned the place. He didn't need an introduction to know who she was. He had seen her before, at community meetings and in HOA bulletins filled with condescending language about preserving neighborhood integrity. Karen Woods, the president of the Oak Ridge Homeowner Association, was infamous for her aggressive enforcement of rules, excessive fines, and an obsessive need to control everything in sight. Ethan had always ignored the HOA politics, knowing that his estate wasn't subject to their authority. But as Karen strode toward his front porch, he had the sinking feeling that she didn't see it that way. Ethan stepped outside, arms crossed, as Karen barely slowed down. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell, I assume," she said, her tone curt and businesslike. Before he could respond, she swept a gloved hand toward his hedges, a neatly maintained, slightly overgrown row of green shrubs lining his front boundary. "These are unacceptable. HOA guidelines require all landscaping to meet community aesthetic standards. You'll need to trim them immediately." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "I appreciate your concern, but my property isn't part of the Oak Ridge HOA. This estate existed long before your association was even formed." Karen's smile didn't falter, but her eyes sharpened. "That doesn't matter. If your land is within the boundaries of our community, then you must follow our regulations. Everyone has to contribute to maintaining neighborhood standards." Ethan felt a spark of irritation, but he kept his voice level. "I have property records that prove otherwise. My family's owned this land for over 100 years. We were never under HOA jurisdiction." Karen ignored his words entirely, crossing her arms. "You have 1 week. If the hedges aren't trimmed to code, you'll receive a fine." And with that, she turned on her heel and walked away, heels clicking against his driveway, as if the conversation was already over. Ethan stood there, fists clenched, watching her leave. She had dismissed his deed, his rights, his ownership, as if none of it mattered. That should have been the end of it. But something about Karen's smug confidence told him that this was only the beginning. The next few days passed in relative quiet, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't finished. There was something about the way she had dismissed his words, the absolute confidence in her tone, that unsettled him. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was claiming his land as if her authority was unquestionable. He told himself to let it go, that she was just another overzealous HOA president with too much time on her hands. But when he stepped outside that Thursday morning, the sight in front of him erased any hope that this would be the end of it. A bright orange violation notice was nailed to his front gate. Not taped. Nailed. Right into the wood, as if whoever put it there wanted to make a statement. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he yanked the paper free, his irritation quickly turning into full-blown anger as he read the bolded text. Notice of violation, Oak Ridge Homeowner Association. Property located at Caldwell Estate. Fine amount, $11,000. Infraction, failure to maintain landscaping in accordance with HOA standards. Compliance deadline, 7 days. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. $11,000? For what? A hedge that was slightly overgrown? He flipped the paper over, searching for a contact number, and within seconds, he was inside, grabbing his phone and dialing the HOA office. The line rang several times before an automated message played, directing him to press 1 for violations. He jabbed the button and waited. Then, a click. Oak Ridge Homeowner Association, a familiar voice answered, dripping with forced politeness. "This is Karen Woods." "Karen," Ethan said, his voice cold, "I just found an illegal violation notice nailed to my property. I already told you, I am not under your HOA's jurisdiction." A pause. Then, a smug chuckle. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, the condescension thick in her tone, "as I mentioned before, our legal team is reviewing your claim. Until then, I strongly suggest you comply. It will save you a lot of trouble." Ethan clenched his jaw. Save him trouble? Was she threatening him now? "Karen, I'm going to say this once. Stay off my land. Any further attempts to find me, trespass, or harass me will have legal consequences." Karen let out a soft laugh, the sound so infuriatingly smug it made Ethan grip his phone tighter. "Do what you feel you need to, Mr. Caldwell. But understand this, the HOA exists to maintain the integrity of our community. If you refuse to cooperate, well, you might find it difficult to remain here." Ethan hung up without another word, knowing any further conversation would only fuel his anger. His next call was to Rachel Monroe, his lawyer. She picked up almost immediately. "Rachel, I need you to do something for me," he said, his voice clipped. "I just got an $11,000 fine from the HOA. I already told them my property isn't under their authority, but they're pushing it anyway. I want them off my back." Rachel didn't sound surprised. "I had a feeling they wouldn't give up that easily," she sighed. "All right, first step, document everything. Take a picture of the violation notice, your gate, your hedges, everything. I'll draft a cease and desist letter and have it sent to their office. If they continue this harassment, we'll escalate legally." Ethan agreed, but even as he set about taking photos, something felt off. The way Karen had spoken on the phone, so confident, so sure of her power, it was as if she already had something planned. That night, Ethan heard a noise outside. A dull thud, followed by the unmistakable crunch of gravel underfoot. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto his porch, scanning the area. Nothing. The trees rustled slightly in the breeze, and the long driveway leading to the main road was empty. But something still felt wrong. The next morning, his unease was confirmed. His mailbox was smashed, completely caved in, as if someone had taken a bat to it. His truck's front tires had been slashed, long jagged gashes running across the rubber. He stormed toward his security cameras, only to find that the footage had mysteriously cut out for 3 hours overnight. Someone had tampered with his system. Ethan's blood boiled. This wasn't just about HOA rules anymore. This was personal. He immediately called the police, explaining the vandalism and the ongoing harassment from the HOA. When the officer arrived, he listened carefully, took notes, and examined the damage before sighing. "No hard evidence on who did it," he admitted. "We can file a report, but unless you catch someone in the act, there's not much we can do." Ethan clenched his fists. "And what about the cameras? Someone disabled them. That's not a coincidence." The officer nodded. "I agree, but again, without proof of who did it, we can't make an arrest." Just as the officer was finishing up, a neighbor hesitantly approached. A middle-aged man, someone Ethan had seen in passing but had never spoken to directly. He looked around nervously before lowering his voice. I saw something last night," he admitted. "Around midnight, there was a black SUV parked near your gate. I noticed because it had a HOA logo on the side." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Did you see who was driving?" The man shook his head quickly. "No, sorry. But, listen, I'd appreciate it if you didn't mention I told you anything. I've already had my own issues with the HOA, and I don't want any trouble. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding the man's fear. He watched as the officer scribbled down the detail about the SUV, but even as the patrol car drove away, Ethan knew Karen had sent a message loud and clear. This wasn't just about fines. This was a power play. And he had no doubt that Karen had just started her game. Ethan knew the situation was spiraling into something far worse than an overzealous HOA president with a clipboard. The vandalism, the tampered cameras, the intimidation tactics, it was a deliberate strategy. Karen wasn't just trying to enforce arbitrary rules, she was testing how much she could get away with. And now, after everything, Ethan was done playing defense. He installed new security cameras, this time, with backup cloud storage and motion-triggered alerts sent straight to his phone. If anyone so much as set foot on his property without permission, he would know immediately. He also started keeping a detailed log of every interaction with Karen and the HOA, storing documents, dates, and photos in a digital and physical file. If she wanted a war, he would give her one. But Karen wasn't finished. 2 mornings later, Ethan was drinking coffee on his porch when he noticed a large white truck parked outside his gate. At first, he thought it was a delivery, but when the side door slid open, revealing a team of landscapers unloading tools, his stomach turned. He was off the porch in an instant, marching down his driveway, his boots crunching against the gravel. The crew foreman, an older man with a clipboard, barely looked up as Ethan approached. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Ethan demanded. The man sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Sir, we've been contracted by the HOA to bring this property into compliance. We're here to trim the hedges, remove unauthorized structures, and clear any excessive debris." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Who gave you permission to enter my property?" The foreman glanced down at his clipboard, flipping through the pages. "Says here this address falls under Oak Ridge Homeowner Association jurisdiction." Ethan stepped closer, voice dangerously low. "This property does not belong to the HOA. And unless you and your crew want to be charged with criminal trespassing, I suggest you pack up your things and get the hell off my land." The crew hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. The foreman exhaled sharply, clearly not wanting to get involved in whatever power struggle was unfolding. "Fine. But I need to report back to my client." "Yeah, you do that." Ethan stood there, arms crossed, watching as the crew hurriedly loaded their equipment back onto the truck. The moment they were gone, he stormed inside, grabbed his phone, and called Rachel. "They just sent a landscaping crew to trespass on my property," he snapped as soon as she answered. "I barely stopped them before they started hacking away at my garden." Rachel cursed under her breath. "That's an escalation. Did you get photos?" "Of everything," Ethan assured her. "Good. I'll be adding this to the cease and desist letter." At this point, Karen's crossing into criminal territory. Ethan hung up, his grip on his phone tightening. If Karen thought she could keep pushing him until he caved, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. But the moment he thought he had seen the worst of her tactics, she proved just how low she was willing to go. That afternoon, he found a formal-looking letter taped to his front door. He snatched it off and scanned the contents, his fury growing with every word. Notice of obstruction and non-compliance. Your actions have deliberately impeded necessary community improvements. The Oak Ridge Homeowner Association has the right to ensure that all properties maintain proper standards. Your continued refusal to comply will result in additional fines, legal action, and potential restrictions on property privileges. Ethan let out a harsh laugh. Property privileges? On his own private land? This was harassment, plain and simple. And then, just when he thought he couldn't be more disgusted, Animal Control showed up at his door. 2 officers in tan uniforms stood on his porch, shifting uncomfortably as Ethan opened the door. "Sir, We received multiple complaints about excessive barking coming from this residence. Ethan stared at them, barely comprehending what he was hearing. My dog? The officer nodded. Anonymous reports stated that the noise has been ongoing at all hours. We've been asked to verify if there's a disturbance and whether the property is in violation of local pet noise ordinances. Ethan exhaled sharply, gripping the doorframe. His dog, Bailey, was a 10-year-old golden retriever, well-trained, quiet, and more likely to fall asleep at someone's feet than bark for no reason. The only complaint was coming from Karen. He forced himself to stay calm. My dog doesn't bark all night. And even if he did, this property is not under HOA jurisdiction. The officer hesitated. Sir, you might want to take this up with them directly. But if we receive another complaint, we may have to take further action. Ethan could feel the rage simmering just below the surface. He clenched his jaw and gave a curt nod. You do what you have to. And I'll do what I have to. As soon as the officers left, Ethan turned toward his street, his eyes locking onto Karen, who was standing near the sidewalk, watching. She smiled. A mocking, triumphant smirk. That was it. She had sent a landscaping crew to trespass. She had tried to fine him for violations that didn't exist. She had vandalized his property in the dead of night. And now she was trying to take away his dog? Ethan took a slow, steady breath and turned away, forcing himself back inside before he did something Karen could twist into a legal weapon against him. His hands were shaking as he pulled out his phone. He dialed Rachel. Change of plans, he said, voice hard. I'm done playing defense. Rachel's tone sharpened. What are you thinking? I want everything documented, every letter, every fine, every violation. And I want that cease and desist letter sent by the end of the day. He paused, his voice turning cold. And after that, we hit them where it hurts. Rachel let out a slow breath. All right. I'll start preparing the paperwork. If Karen wants a fight, we'll give her one. Ethan set his jaw and looked out toward his property, the place he had spent years preserving, caring for, and protecting. She wanted a war. She just got one. The official letter arrived at the HOA office by noon. Rachel had drafted a cease and desist order so airtight that even a corrupt organization like Oak Ridge Homeowner Association couldn't ignore it. It outlined every instance of harassment, trespassing, vandalism, and fraudulent enforcement that Karen had carried out against Ethan, warning that any further action against him would result in an immediate lawsuit. The letter alone should have been enough to make them back off. But Ethan knew Karen by now. Backing off wasn't in her nature. That suspicion was confirmed the very next day when an envelope with the HOA's logo appeared in his mailbox. Ethan knew before opening it that Karen wasn't surrendering, she was doubling down. Mandatory compliance hearing. Due to repeated violations and failure to uphold community standards, you are required to attend a formal hearing before the Oak Ridge Homeowner Association Board to discuss next steps regarding your non-compliance. Attendance is mandatory. Ethan let out a slow breath, staring at the paper, willing himself to stay calm. Mandatory? He wasn't even in the HOA. They had no authority over him, yet here they were, acting as if he had to answer to them like some delinquent child who had broken curfew. This wasn't just a power play anymore. Karen wanted to humiliate him in public, to make an example of him in front of the entire neighborhood. Fine. Let them try. Ethan didn't just show up to the meeting. He prepared. On the night of the hearing, he walked into the Oak Ridge Community Center carrying a leather-bound folder filled with legal documents, property records, and photographic evidence. The room was already packed. Neighbors filled the rows of metal chairs, some out of curiosity, others out of fear. They had seen what happened when someone defied Karen. Karen was already seated at the front, flanked by two board members who looked more like puppets than decision-makers. Her lips curled into a saccharine smile as Ethan took a seat at the front. "Mr. Caldwell," she said smoothly, "we appreciate you taking the time to come. Hopefully, we can resolve this amicably." Ethan set his folder down and met her gaze. "Let's see what you have to say first." Karen launched into a ridiculous list of alleged infractions: failure to maintain landscaping, unauthorized structures, even an accusation that Ethan was running an unapproved business from home because he sometimes allowed professional photographers to use his scenic property for shoots. She spoke as though she was presenting an airtight case, as though she truly believed she had the authority to dictate his life. When she finished, Ethan didn't even flinch. He calmly opened his folder and held up his property deed. "This document," he said, voice steady, "proves that my estate predates the Oak Ridge HOA. It has never been under your jurisdiction." He placed a second document onto the table. "This is a letter from my attorney confirming that the HOA has no legal authority over my land." Then, a third document. "This is a formal cease and desist order sent to your office, warning that any further harassment, trespassing, or fines will result in legal action." That was yesterday. And yet, here we are. Karen's smile wavered, but she quickly regained her composure. "While your property may technically fall outside of our original HOA boundaries, it is still part of the greater community," she said, voice tight. "It is only fair that you contribute to maintaining its standards." Ethan laughed, an actual, genuine laugh of disbelief. "Karen, this isn't about fairness. This is about control. You're desperate to enforce power over a property that was never yours to regulate." A murmur ran through the crowd. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across the faces of the HOA board members. Then, a voice spoke up from the back. "I got fined $500 for having a bird feeder," an older woman said, standing slowly. Eleanor Briggs, one of Ethan's neighbors. Karen whipped around to glare at her, but Eleanor wasn't backing down. Another man stood. "They made us repaint our front door, twice. Because Karen said the color didn't fit the aesthetic." A younger couple raised their hands. "We've had to replace our mailbox 3 times because the HOA kept changing the approved design." More voices followed. Ethan watched as the entire room turned against Karen. Her composure cracked as people listed years of arbitrary rules, fines, and harassment. It became impossible to ignore. Karen had been abusing her position for years, and now her entire community was calling her out. One of the board members, Mark Whitman, cleared his throat, looking more than a little uncomfortable. "Karen," he said carefully, "I think we need to reconsider our approach here." Karen shot him a glare that could have melted steel. "Mark, we have a responsibility." "To what?" Ethan cut in. "To bully your own neighbors? To fine them over nothing? To try and take away a home that was never yours to begin with?" The room was silent. Then, applause. Karen's face turned red as the weight of the situation sank in. The control she had wielded for years was slipping through her fingers. She opened her mouth to speak, but this time, no one was listening. The board members huddled together, exchanging hushed whispers. Finally, Mark turned to face the room. "We'll take the matter under review," he said, clearly trying to salvage some level of authority. "And we will reevaluate HOA enforcement policies going forward." Ethan smirked. "Yeah, you do that." Karen grabbed her papers in a huff and stormed out of the room, her heels clicking against the tile. She had lost. But Ethan had a feeling this wasn't over. Ethan knew Karen wouldn't let go without a fight. Losing in front of the entire community wasn't just a setback for her, it was a humiliation she couldn't tolerate. He expected retaliation, but even he was shocked by how bold and reckless her next move would be. 2 mornings after the hearing, he woke to the distant rumble of heavy machinery. When he stepped onto his porch, he saw them, a bulldozer and a work crew, parked near his property line. His stomach twisted as he took in the sight of men in bright orange vests, standing near his historic ivy-covered fence, tools in hand, preparing to tear it down. He was already moving before his brain fully caught up. "Hey," he called out, striding toward them. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The crew foreman barely looked up from his clipboard. "We've been ordered by the HOA to remove this fence and clear overgrown vegetation." Ethan laughed bitterly. "Ordered by who? This property is private land. You have no authority here." Before the foreman could answer, Karen appeared. She was standing near the curb, arms crossed, her expression sharp with triumph. "Mr. Caldwell," she said smoothly, "this fence is a community eyesore. We've received multiple complaints, and as part of our commitment to maintaining neighborhood aesthetics, we're addressing the issue." Ethan's fingers curled into fists. "You are trespassing on private property. That is illegal." Karen's smirk didn't falter. "Call it what you want, but this fence is coming down. Unless, of course, you'd rather comply voluntarily." Ethan pulled out his phone without hesitation. "Fine. Let's get law enforcement involved and see what they think." Karen's smile faltered for the briefest second, but she recovered quickly. "Go ahead," she said, folding her arms. "We're well within our rights." She wasn't. And 20 minutes later, she learned that the hard way. The officer who arrived was all business. She listened to Ethan, looked over the fence, then turned to Karen. "Ma'am, do you have legal documentation proving HOA authority over this land?" Karen hesitated. Well, not on hand, but..." "Then you need to leave," the officer said firmly. "The HOA has no right to enforce anything here. If you or your contractors step foot on this property again, you'll be charged with trespassing." The workers packed up immediately. Karen stood there, seething, her jaw tight as the last remnants of her power slipped through her fingers. She didn't say another word as she turned and stalked away, but Ethan knew this wasn't over. Not until he made sure it was. Over the next week, he worked with Rachel to finalize a lawsuit against the HOA for harassment, trespassing, and property damage. But before they even filed, Ethan took one last, decisive step. He compiled every letter, every fine, every absurd HOA rule, and every neighbor's testimony into a detailed report. Then, he sent it to every resident in Oak Ridge. The response was instant. Within days, HOA members were outraged, demanding an emergency vote. Karen's abuses were finally exposed in full daylight. The meeting that followed wasn't just about Ethan, it became a reckoning. One by one, residents stood up, sharing stories of fines, intimidation, and Karen's dictatorial leadership. The HOA board, under immense pressure, had no choice. Karen was removed from her position. The lawsuit Ethan had prepared settled out of court. The HOA paid for damages, issued a formal apology, and agreed to restructure their policies. The reign of Karen Woods was over. As Ethan sat on his porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the trees, he finally felt it, peace. His land was safe. His legacy was untouched. More than that, the entire neighborhood was free. Karen had spent years wielding power over people who were too afraid to fight back. And all it had taken was one person refusing to be bullied to bring her down. So now the question is, have you ever had to fight back against a Karen or an HOA gone rogue? Share your story below. Let's see who had it worse.